Welcome to this lesson on potentially the most common critical reasoning question task that you will encounter on the GMAT, and that is questions asking you to strengthen the argument. So let's first just talk about what the overall logistics are for critical reasoning style questions in the GMAT. First, understand that this is most likely going to be the least frequently occurring question type critical reasonings as a whole. You're going to have approximately 10 critical reasoning questions in a given 36 question verbal section, but usually it's somewhere between 9 to 12. And generally, about 80% of those critical reasoning tasks are going to focus on evaluating or addressing something with an argument. And about 20% are going to be inference tasks, which are those types that ask you to simply determine what must be from the answer choices based on the statements of fact that have been given in the prompt. Now, strategically, you want to assume about 2 minutes per question on critical reasonings in the GMAT. And this is going to be a hair over the under a minute 50, about a minute 48 per question average if you were just to set a mean for all 36 questions in that 65 minutes. And you can have up to 3 minutes for any critical reasoning, especially earlier in the section, because we do know that earlier questions in the sections do have a greater impact on the GMAT overall scoring curve. And you will want to engage with the task of the question before reading the prompt. So don't read the paragraph, then read the question, and then promptly reread the prompt. Instead, go straight to the question task to determine what you need to do for that critical reasoning before reading the paragraph. You do have to limit yourself to a single reread of that prompt, though, before you decide to just eliminate choices for common wrong answers and guess. Because, again, critical reasonings are probably the primary type of question where you can just keep reading, rereading, and rereading and not really notice that time is slipping away. You will need to take targeted notes to proactively address whatever the specific question task is, including strengthened tasks, as we will talk about here. But this critical reasoning format is going to be the primary question format to guess and skip if you are behind pace at your checkpoints of question 12 and question 24, basically splitting the exam's verbal section into thirds. If you have fewer than 40 minutes remaining after the first 12 questions, you may consider proactively seeking critical reasoning questions to skip. And if you have fewer than 20 minutes remaining after question 24, heading into the final third, again, you may proactively look for critical reasonings to skip because they are self contained. So it's not like reading comprehension where you have to understand the passage and address 3 or 4 questions. Here, if you skip a critical reasoning, it only impacts that one individual question in the exam scoring. So let's talk specifically about those strengthen the argument tasks. So to identify these, first you need to recognize the reference to an argument in the question stem. So the question stem for argumentation critical reasonings usually are going to explicitly reference either a conclusion or an argument, and that is your first clue that, hey, I'm dealing with something involving an argument and needing to address it. You'll also, for strengthen the argument questions, note specific task words such as strengthen, support, justify, or even since, and then a blank. These are what are known as since strengthens because the blank is basically where you're going to put your support after the transition term of since. And you have to be careful with strengthen the argument task because you can potentially mistake them for an inference task if you're simply looking for the word support. So the word support has to, for a strengthened task, indicate that you're seeking an answer choice to support your prompt. If your prompt is intended to support a choice, that is not a strengthen the argument task. That is instead going to be an inference task. Only when support means a choice supports the paragraph or prompt or argument or conclusion is your question going to have a strengthen the argument task. So strategically, for strengthen the argument task, these are ultimately one of the more straightforward critical reasoning tasks and one of the most common that you may see on the exam. You'll have to begin by reading the prompt and identifying the explicit conclusion of the argument, as you will for any argumentation style critical reasoning. And you'll try to categorically identify one of our common types of support or common types of argument to broadly predict the support for that argument. And we'll be going through that in a bit more detail here through a couple of examples and a few slides here in a moment. You need to focus on your common wrong argument answer choices to eliminate incorrect options. So the big three are going to be things that are going to have a vague impact on the argument, things that require additional information that is outside of the argument, and things that are addressing the opposite task. So basically, they weaken the argument as opposed to strengthen it. And you can eliminate more quickly if you have a good prediction and one of the answer choices matches that prediction. So that's the entire purpose of this lesson, is to expedite your evaluation of strength in the argument tasks by recognizing some of those common argument structures and knowing how just abstractly you would broadly strengthen that type of argument. So let's revisit the argumentation equation first. So we know that a conclusion is the ultimate outcome of any argument, and that conclusion is going to be your explicitly stated subjective opinion that requires support to believe. And the way that you get to your conclusion is through what is known as the premise. And the premise is going to be your explicit objective facts that are intended to provide support for that explicit conclusion. And your assumption are the facts or an individual fact that must be true to logically provide the link between your premise to your conclusion. And every one of your common argumentation addressing tasks is basically going to require you to impact that assumption in some way. So, in order to strengthen the argument, you need to find additional information in the answer choices to show that your implicit assumption or assumptions that link the premises to your conclusion are in fact likely to be true. So you're basically saying, hey, this assumption that we need to believe this conclusion based on the premise seems reasonable. And your arguments can be categorized often in multiple ways. And we'll go through the big five of common argument formats and styles that you'll see on the GMAT here in this lesson. But recognize that oftentimes they can be categorized in multiple ways. They can have overlap between the types of categories. But being able to specify how the premise gets to the conclusion using one of these categories can help you to be more efficient and expedited in predicting broadly how a choice would support that claim through its standardized assumption. So our common arguments, first we've got an analogy. An analogy argument basically just says that one is like the other, or A equals B. And your assumption for all analogy arguments is that the items in the argument from the premise to the conclusion are comparable in relevant ways. So to strengthen or support, you need to find information that should eliminate possibly relevant differences, or more explicitly articulate how the two items that are used in the argument are similar in a relevant fashion. So you're looking to say, yes, these two things are actually comparable. Now, representation-based arguments are going to be the ones that ask you to make a conclusion based on some representative sample or some other grouping that you then extrapolate to a larger whole. And your assumption for any representative sampling or representation argument is that your sample is representative of that larger whole population that's referenced in the conclusion. So your likely support for any argument that is based upon a representative sample should show that the terms that are used in the evidence and the conclusion are interchangeable, so that you don't have a subtle term shift that actually isn't necessarily related, or just broadly show that whatever your provided sample is somehow or otherwise analogous to the overall population. So you're like, whatever my sample size is would reasonably be expected to represent, again, a larger whole. So let's take a look at a sample critical reasoning. So the first thing we always do is read the task in the question. So which of the following, if true, most strengthens the argument above? So we recognize the key term indicating a strengthened task. We've got most strengthened, so obviously we need to strengthen this argument. Then we want to read the prompt as presented, noting types of evidence to potentially recognize a common argument. So we read from the beginning. Many types of yogurt are fortified with nutritional supplements, and some of these yogurts provide more than 3 times the recommended daily values of those supplements. Therefore, someone who eats yogurt regularly is likely to consume more than the recommended daily value for certain nutritional supplements. And we can see some quantifying terms, such as many types of yogurt. And the many types of yogurt may indicate a representative sample type of argument. So we then have our explicit conclusion at the end, which is based on the statement about those many types of yogurt, which is that someone who eats that yogurt regularly is likely to consume more than the recommended daily value for certain nutritional supplements. Again, you're going to want to take these notes, but I'm just highlighting them for the purposes of this instruction. Then you want to broadly predict what the correct answer should do to strengthen that argument based on the reasoning. And it could be something as simple as show that many types of yogurt is a representative sample that will lead to consuming more than the recommended daily value of supplements for someone who eats that yogurt regularly. So we've got our prediction and can now introduce our answer choices. And we need to consider our common wrong argumentation reasons, including vague impact. So choice D, we could see, says some nutritional supplements are more important than other supplements. That could not be much more vague if it tried. It does not address this representation issue of many types of yogurt to just a general someone who eats yogurt regularly. We also have answer choices that require additional information, such as choice B that says yogurt is less healthy than bran flakes. Okay, we don't know based on the paragraph how healthy bran flakes are, so that allows us to eliminate that as requiring additional information pretty directly. We also have answer choices that may weaken the argument as opposed to strengthen, even obliquely. So, choice C, for instance, says no yogurt contains all recommended nutritional supplements. And if that's true, then it makes yogurt seem less healthy, but it's really not all that relevant to our argument either. But you want to be careful about applying the rubric of out of scope to your elimination process because you can overlook something that may actually be relevant. So it's better to say, yeah, if it actually doesn't have the nutritional supplements, that would broadly and kind of weakly weaken, but certainly not strengthen. And similarly for choice E, yogurt alone does not suffice for a balanced diet. Well, first off, I need additional information about what a balanced diet is. Secondly, if yogurt is not helping with health, that seems to, again, obliquely, broadly, tangentially weaken the argument, not strengthen it. But if we consider choice A, it says yogurts with nutritional supplements comprise more than 75% of all yogurts available. Well, now it makes it seem that someone who eats yogurt regularly is more likely to engage with these many types of yogurt that are fortified with nutritional supplements. Because many types of yogurt actually could be a small percentage if we weren't careful about making that assumption. Choice A clarifies that assumption for us, shows that the sample of many is actually a larger percentage, and therefore would be our correct answer. That basically eliminates a possible incorrect assumption and thereby strengthens the argument. So let's continue on and take a look at the other common argument types that you'll see, including data and evidence and interpretation. And you may be thinking to yourself, that last one kind of seemed like data, evidence, and interpretation too, and it really was. So remember, you can categorize these argument types in multiple ways, but your assumption for data and evidence interpretation is that there's no other reasonable interpretation of that data or evidence. And in that case, we could have just reconsidered the argument about the yogurt to say that there was no other reasonable interpretation of the fact about the many types of yogurt, except to say what we said about someone who eats yogurt regularly. And your support for a data or evidence interpretation argument structure is going to likely provide additional data and possibly literal numbers or percentages, as we saw in that last example, or evidence to support that conclusion's reasoning. So again, you want to say that, yeah, the outcome that was expected or the interpretation of the data or evidence is reasonable based on additional evidence that was provided by an answer choice. Then we get to causalities, and causalities are basically how you could categorize just about every argument if you so choose. It's the big one, which says that because A happened, B happened. So it's saying there's a direct link between the action that is described as whatever comes first and the thing that comes up subsequently. Now, a causality assumes that there are no other possible causes or outcomes based on that relationship between the two variables, and that whatever the circumstance is between the two variables is not simply a coincidence. So, your support for a causality should eliminate another cause or outcome as being possible and potentially just show another instance of the phenomenon that indicates that it's less likely that the relationship is coincidental because it happened some other time. Then we've got our plan or recommendation arguments. So, a plan or recommendation assumes that you're going to execute the plan, and whatever the plan is going to work according to the defined success metric. And that's hugely important. You have to always carefully note what the metric of success will be for the plan that has been presented by an argument. And your support for a plan or recommendation style argument should show that the execution of the plan or recommendation will likely result in success as has been defined by the argument. So again, you just have to show that the plan will work. So we've got another sample critical reasoning here. And as always, we read the question task first. Which of the following, if true, most supports the conservationist argument? So we recognize the word supports, and we're saying of the following. So this is not an inference task. This is going to be an argument task, and you can also recognize the term argument in the task itself. Then we want to read the prompt as it's presented, and we've got a conservationist who says, bald eagles are uniquely viewed as symbols of free wilderness and foster sympathy from the general public, unlike any other wild animal. Because sympathy often generates political will, addressing the conservation needs of all species should begin by saving the bald eagle. And we recognize the phrase should begin as a recommendation. This is indicating a plan style argument, and we recognize that. So we then need to identify the explicit conclusion. Again, you take this note yourself on the exam, but we see that the plan to address the conservation needs of all species should begin by saving the bald eagle. So now we want to broadly predict what that correct answer should do to strengthen the argument based on the plan reasoning. So we want to show that the plan to save the bald eagle will work to address the conservation needs of all species, not just that the plan to save the bald eagle will save the bald eagle. So let's introduce our answer choices. And we're going to process of eliminate based on common wrong argumentation reasons as always, starting with vague impacts. And we can see a couple of cans. We've got bald eagles can be seen on many governmental seals and symbols, and the general public can be fickle in pursuing environmental causes. Wonderful. Are they frequently, in terms of the general public being fickle? I don't know. We need more details about that. Does that affect conservation as a specific environmental cause? I don't know. Same thing with bald eagles, them being on governmental seals and symbols. Maybe that's why they have fostered sympathy, but it has nothing to do necessarily about this specific plan. So great reasons to eliminate B&E pretty directly. You also need to make sure that you're not making assumptions about information that is not explicitly stated within the paragraph. So free wilderness itself being in need of dedicated conservation efforts, according to choice D, doesn't necessarily say that we have to do something else. And if anything, it kind of says that we should go with free wilderness before we start saving the bald eagle. But again, that's making some assumptions and probably needs additional information, or it's at worst weakening style answer choice. And the same thing could be said for choice A. We've got the number of bald eagles in the wild has increased significantly in the past decades. Well, now it seems like we don't need to start with the bald eagle at all. So that would, again, show that you should not start with the bald eagle, maybe start with something that is more in need. And if we look at choice C, political will is necessary to sustain efforts that go beyond initial goals. Well, that, while incredibly bland, is going to be something that shows the link between the needing to go to the next level of conservation needs, because we know the bald eagle gets sympathy. Sympathy gets the political will, and the political will then says we will continue. And therefore, the incredibly bland and not all that memorable in terms of like the eagles and conserving animals, answer choice C ends up being our correct answer. So let's talk about our checklist for Stengthen tasks. First, we need to identify the Stengthen task by recognizing key indicator terms and the presence of an argument with a main conclusion. Then we want to read the prompt as written, paying close attention to the type of information provided in the premise, and as always, note the nearly explicit and verbatim conclusion. If a common argument type is identified, you can more specifically predict what the correct answer should do to strengthen that argument based on type. And if no common argument is identified, you could use the generic prediction of just find information to support the conclusion that whatever the conclusion is. And lastly, you want to seek a match to your prediction proactively. And if that happens, you can go a little bit more quickly through eliminating the choices that fail to address the task using your common wrong answer reasons. So let's pop on over to the whiteboard and take a look at a couple more examples to illustrate how, when you actually have to write it yourself, you'll engage with strengthen the argument questions on the exam. So here we have a sample critical reasoning style question on the board. We put our answer choices A through E just for process of elimination purposes. We got a little line over top for a task once we identify it. And we start by just reading up top. We see which of the following most logically completes the passage. So this must be either an inference task or a since strengthen task. And we've got a since with a little line after it. So that indicates, even though we just skipped to the end without reading the whole paragraph, that we are most likely going to have one of those since strengthen tasks where the conclusion is most likely to immediately precede the since that will then provide the evidence for said conclusion, thereby strengthening the argument. So we'll read the paragraph from the beginning. A digital streaming platform recently pivoted from primarily showing family-friendly content to focusing more on explicitly sexual and violent programs. After this change, some companies pulled their advertisements from the platform. Clearly, the change in content has led to a loss in revenue for the streaming platform since blank. So we're going to just put a little PS for predicted strength in here. And we can see that the conclusion is, as was anticipated, right before the since. Now, obviously, on the exam, you can't do my little brackets there, but you'll want to take your note by just synthesizing your prediction with the conclusion. And let's just imagine we don't see a common argument structure here. So we could just say, as our predicted way to strengthen, find info to show that the change from FF content for family friendly to sex and violent content has led to a loss, well, or down revenue for our streaming platform. And if you can't identify a clear common argument structure, this is all you do. You just say, okay, I need to find information to show that this conclusion did in fact happen if I'm looking at a strengthen task. So starting with choice A, we've got its change in content, meaning the streaming platform, has also been criticized by some prominent politicians. Well, some prominent politicians couldn't be much more vague if it tried. And so we can eliminate that pretty much immediately because we don't know that those politicians directly influenced the pulling of the advertisements. We don't even know how many some is. There's way too many questions about that vague qualifier. Now, for choice B, we have the average spend by advertisers did not increase after the content strategy shift by the streaming platform. Now, the average spend by advertisers is certainly going to be relevant. And we know that there was a content strategy shift. So even if I don't immediately recognize the relationship between choice B and how it does actually affect the conclusion, at the very worst, I'm going to use my little tilde or squiggle and say I'm going to hold this because there's nothing that is immediately vague, weakening, or requiring additional outside information in choice B. Now, choice C, ratings have increased by more than 50% since the shift was implemented. Well, ratings having gone up, that could help, but we don't necessarily know. It still requires additional information because without knowing that those ratings led directly to increased ad sales from some other advertisers, we don't have the evidence that there's been this loss in revenue. And in fact, if it is applied and we make that logical leap, it's actually going to weaken more likely because it would show that there'd be an increase in ratings, which, again, we're going to have to make a logical leap, say that's going to cause people to spend more, but it's certainly not going to make them spend less. So it's going to need additional information, or at best, it's weakening when we wanted to strengthen. Choice D, we've got once again, some of the family friendly content was picked up for distribution by a rival platform. Again, that could not be more vague if it tried. And for choice E, we talk about older viewers. Well, that once again needs additional information. And at best, may weaken because it's saying that we've gone to theoretically older viewers with the sexual and violent programs as opposed to family friendly. But again, there's way too many logical leaps that are required to make this connection solid. Whereas choice B really does hit on the issue, which is that if the average spend did not increase after the content strategy shift, well, then by losing some companies, you're losing overall amount. Whereas if the average spend had gone up, you might have individual advertisers offsetting the loss of those some other companies that pulled their advertisements. And therefore, choice B addresses how to strengthen the argument pretty directly. So let's go ahead and take a look at one more example here down on the board here. So setting up the scratch work one more time, we've got A, B, C, D, E, put a little line over top. And this time we're looking to justify the reasoning above. And justify is a slightly more obscure strengthen term, but this is really just asking us to strengthen. I mean, you could use the justify term as well, but it's really just a slight variation on our strengthen task process that we're going to apply here. So we read from the beginning. We've got generally governments respond to public criticism of necessary social services by expanding oversight and regulation of those services. However, an increase in regulations can quickly result in higher costs for consumers. The public is currently criticizing early childcare services, but in this case, families should not necessarily expect to incur greater costs as a result. So we can see that we are clearly dealing with costs, and that oftentimes, whenever we're dealing with actual numbers, can be categorized as a data or evidence interpretation style question. So our predicted strength in here, we can just say, is to find info to show that the evidence of an increase in costs does not necessarily mean an increase in costs for ECS, for early childcare services specifically. So we're going to focus on that specific issue of the costs. So the number of early childcare providers has remained largely static for the past decade. Well, the number is an incredibly vague quantity because it could be like a million, it could be 1,000, it could be 10. So that needs additional information. And we don't know how them staying at a static amount affects the cost for early childcare services specifically. Now, in public surveys, government provided services are rated more poorly than comparable privately provided services. Well, okay, we've introduced the idea of privately provided services this time, and that too needs additional information. We're talking about the government, and we're talking about criticizing early childcare services and regulations, and we actually never really said that they were going to be government provided services even. So there's a whole lot of additional information needed to make B actually address the direct conclusion that the families should not expect to incur greater costs because the public is criticizing early childcare services. Then we've got in the last election cycle, some politicians, oh, that's wonderful. So once again, we've got a delightful vague qualifier. Now, recently passed legislation provides vouchers that parents of young children can use to pay for necessary social services. And if we are focusing specifically on the cost, this provides our cost offset. And we're not going to come up with vouchers in our head and be like, ooh, clearly it's vouchers. But once we're focused on the costs as the evidence, we might be a little bit more prepared to recognize when the costs are being addressed in a choice. Then we've got early child care services are often a significant portion of a family budget. Well, that's wonderful. But again, are often a significant portion of the family budget. If they are a significant portion, then I mean, it seems like, if anything, that's going to weaken the argument, but it probably needs more additional information as well. So you can see when you have an idea of what a common argument structure is, how you can address these strengthen tasks, as well as when you don't identify a common argument structure, how you can still use the same process broadly to address these tasks. So go ahead and practice some strengthen critical reasoning tasks on your own to improve at this specific task that you are likely to encounter on the exam.